Milt's a faculty member currently at Colorado State University, has been the Rouse chair there and oversees a number of activities, including cattle production at the John Rouse Ranch in Wyoming. So Milt's was on faculty here at New Mexico State, so he knows his way around Las Cruces very, very well, and has a great background in production of livestock in these arid and semi-arid and challenging environment climates. So the ranch in Wyoming's at elevation, and so PAP issues and other conditions there that he has to deal with. And so we asked Milt to come and talk, and he's got a new adventure on the horizon, moving back to the family operation in Texas to take a faculty position at Texas A&M and work on development of a new group of cattle at Beeville that have an adaptation component to them as well. And so Milt was a natural choice for us as we looked at this particular topic of understanding and harnessing genetic and environmental interactions and their importance in production and how we should consider those and think about them in our breeding strategies. And so Milt, thank you for joining us, and really great to see you again, friend, and look forward to your comments.
Thank you, and I appreciate the opportunity to speak. This time slot originally was scheduled for Bob Prosser out of Arizona, so it really was a time slot to be less of our kind of omics and science type things and more of that of a breeder. I am a scientist, so I can't help myself by, showing some science and talking about science a little bit, but I also have a lot of experience as a breeder. So I'm gonna kind of morph my talk, kind of a pseudoscience talk, but also some views and things that I've witnessed and experienced along the way as a breeder. Okay, so they want me to talk about G by E and talk about whether they're important in production. So this is kind of my outline. G by E, for somebody that does statistics, that's a very specific phrase or thing you would fit in a statistical model. However, though, from a producer standpoint, or even me as a breeder, it's really more about fitting animals to a resource. Okay, and I'll talk more about that so we get a better feel for it. I want to talk then about environmental challenges. I appreciate Tony's slide talking about more and more people in the world. I think we've been shooting ourselves in the foot for quite some time in both the academic side and also on all the political ag side of not talking about the challenges of population growth. Folks, that's not that far off. You're talking about 10 billion people by 2050 or 30 years. That's whatever you want to calculate, 5-6 generations of cattle selection. There are major issues on the horizon coming quick. And so we talk a lot about environmental change, environmental challenges. So I think that's all kind of just meshed together. Then I want to talk about genetic challenges. I don't know if those are genetic challenges. I'm struggling with the semantics of that. These are genetic successes, genetic challenges, and I'll talk about that. Then, as I said, I want to then spend time talking about messages from experience. Even though Bob Prosser couldn't be here today, I was bold and I just called him up and said, "Hey, Bob, what were you going to say?" And so he shared some wisdom with me, and I got some slides on that. And then I'll share some of my experiences from breeding and experiences from being part of what we call the Western Region Animal Ag Experimentation Breeding Programs, where we all kind of met together, and I'll share some data from that and thoughts as well. So G by E, from a statistical standpoint, this is what we usually talk about. Okay. And so this is it's kind of a famous slide, so that anybody that ever talks about genetics or takes a genetics course or whatever, you talk about G by E. This, if you're in the ag side of it, particularly animal science, this is the slide you always get to look at. And this slide has been made over many times over. It's from a 1979 publication in Journal of Animal Science. And what it was is where they had two populations of cattle, kind of some classic line bred type Hereford cattle in Montana, at a USDA ARS facility known as Fort Keogh, and everybody knows Line 1 and all the other lines that they had there. And they had a similar kind of breeding program going on in Florida, which used to be a station called Brooksville. Okay. And so what they did is they swapped some cattle between the two and compared how they did. Okay. And so the story out of it is it always makes an X, and that's how you get that G by E kind of out of your statistical model, but there's home court advantage, right? The cattle in Montana did better than the cattle moved from Florida to Montana, and the cattle in Florida did better than the cattle that moved from Montana to Florida. Home court advantage. Actually, I did a little research past few days on home court advantage, or home field advantage. And we talk about that in baseball, football, and whatnot. But basketball, that effect is much greater than it is in the outdoor sports. Now, I get it today. We got dome stadiums. You can pack 100,000 people in an SEC game, whatever, and they can make a pretty big crowd, but it's still never going to be as loud as it is, if you put all 10, 12,000 people screaming their head off in a basketball arena. So the effect of home court advantage is substantially more in basketball than the other outdoor sports. Okay. I know the people in here over the past few days, somebody talked about things up at Iowa State. There's a lot of genetics goes on at Iowa State. Yeah, that Hilton Coliseum in Ames, Iowa, that's a tough place to go play if you're the out-of-towner. Here locally, it's this kind of three-way challenge of UTEP versus NMSU versus the UNM Lobos, and that's always a big deal. When the other one comes to town, how big a crowd can you pack in there and get real loud and have a home court advantage? And that's an environmental effect, right? That's an environmental effect. And that's how we get into this G by E. You got known genetics, move to a different environment, and so forth. Okay. But typically when we talk about G by E more in a production setting, it's very, very difficult to set up data sets and studies to do the true G by E, particularly with livestock. Okay. It's very, very difficult. So we do a lot of research where we compare animals of different environments and so forth. So this is a slide that Derek Bailey was talking about yesterday. In the section that Mark Inns chairs, has more to do with animal adaptability and those kinds of things. And it's just a really interesting data set over here on the, all right, I'm already messing up. Okay, over here on the y-axis, we got crude protein, and then we got 3 different time periods of grazing: winter, early summer, and late. So what this was is we had 3 groups of cows that were fairly similar type pedigrees. These were Brangus cows. And we had cattle that had never been on a Chihuahuan desert, big open rangeland. We're going to call them naive. We had native cows that had been born on that desert, lived their entire life on that desert, never been off of it. And then we had some cows that we called tourist. Okay, they were on that desert. We had a severe drought. They had to move to East Texas to get through the drought, and then they came back. So then we were comparing how did they do when we put them together. And it's just very interesting. This is crude protein percent out of their fecal matter. So it's basically just telling us what do they eat out there. And so in the first grazing bout, that would have been done in winter, and that's a lovely time of year here in southern New Mexico. And the cows that were naive and had never been on the desert, they didn't know how to go out and work the desert. All they knew how to eat was grass. As a matter of fact, in that first grazing bout, they were actually afraid to leave sight of water. And that's a big deal in the desert because we have pastures that might be, sometimes we say, hey, we got cows in a 10-section pasture, and they got to walk a long way from water. Matter of fact, we don't take any forage or range measurements within at least half a mile of water. Okay, because we want them to really truly get out in the pasture because they overgraze around the water sites. Okay, and so those cows were afraid to get out of water, and they only knew how to eat grass, and it's wintertime, the grasses are poor. But the cattle that had been in the desert, they know how to go out and forage the desert, and they eat, mesquite beans and yucca stalks and all kinds of other things, right? And so their crude protein levels in the manure are higher because they go out and find better feed. And then as you went across this time period from winter to early summer into late summer, then those naive cows that never been desert, they're eating really good grass in the late summer because here rain only comes from about July to September. That's the summer monsoon. Yeah, it's toward drought now and it looks bad, but it always looks bad here in May. That's we're in the driest time of year in the Chihuahuan desert. And so they got to eating grass, when the grass was green, and as you can see, boy, things looked a lot better. Okay. And so that's kind of an environmental effect. They're fairly similar genetics. There's probably some permanent environmental effects in that of, how they were raised or where they were actually born. Then there's temporary environmental effects. As they moved across time, those cows had never been in the desert. They started to learn how to work the desert. So that things got different. So a lot of times in animal sciences or in animal production, that's kind of what we think of G by E, because we don't really have the data to truly test the G by E very often. Okay, so another thing when we start talking about selecting animals that fit the desert. Well, here was one of those things that at the beginning probably was a good idea and it turned out to be a disaster. Anytime you bring a non-native species into, a big ecosystem, usually whatever comes out of that is not good. So sometime in the late 60s, they brought these African gemsboks, what New Mexico Game and Fish calls an oryx, into this environment, and they put them on the missile range. Huge place, bigger than the state of Vermont or Connecticut. And, said, well, that's a good place for them to live. And they can, problem is they thrive in this environment. There's no natural predators to them. And so, boy, they populate like crazy. And this was a picture I took in 2005. I don't know how many's there, 8 to 10, whatever. And now we got 80 to 100 of them on one of our NMSU properties, which is non-missile range properties. And that's a real problem because, each of those is going to weigh 400 or 500 pounds. And all of a sudden they're eating into our animal units for the entire ranch. And, so that seems really good from an ag standpoint. You can say, well, you got this really harsh desert rangeland, and this animal obviously thrives here, right? So from a food production standpoint, that sounds like a pretty good idea. Problem with that is these animals are not domesticated, right? So yeah, there's a hunting program and things like that for them, but things like this are difficult to manage. Okay. And so that's why, when we talk about Western rangelands and that kind of thing, we're not talking about non-native species. We're talking about domesticated species, Bos indicus, Bos taurus. And these are just pictures that from my walk across life over the last 25 years of animals that I worked with, up there's some Angus and Brahmins that I crossed. Those Angus bulls are off the current NMSU Corona Ranch. Kind of a classic Eastern New Mexico picture. You could see that kind of picture from New Mexico all the way up through Colorado, Wyoming, typical kind of look. Up in that one corner, that's the Rouse Ranch and the North Platte River coming through there. It's that Angus heifers. And then the last heifer on there, I just threw in there. That's one of my wife's heifers and down in South Texas. But it's just a whole variety of type of, animals that have been, somebody's working hard on trying to select animals to meet an environment. Okay, so to me, as we think about the beef industry, we gather here today to talk about seed stock and genetics and those kinds of things. And there was a question posed for this talk, but to me, this is the real question. Can we manage G/E across diverse environments and produce a competitive or an acceptable end product, no matter what environment we're in? Okay, and so I struggle with the semantics of that. What's a competitive product? What's an acceptable product? Okay. I got myself in a lot of trouble when I first got to New Mexico State because somebody called me up and said something about, Texas Longhorns and their value to the beef industry in the desert. And I said, well, yeah, they do real well because if you don't reproduce and don't grow very much, you'll probably live out there a long time. And I probably just got myself in trouble for saying that again. But, the reality of that is, what is a competitive or an acceptable beef product? There's lots of niche markets and all that kind of thing. But, if you're going to haul that animal to Tyson Meats in Amarillo or somewhere, there's a certain kind of product there that they desire and they're going to pay you for. And the rest of that, they're not going to pay you very much. Okay. So that's a real challenge to us. Okay. So let's talk about some big environmental factors that we face. I took this off the Drought Monitor. This is published at University of Nebraska, Lincoln website somewhere. I look at this every week, and part of the world we're in right now, boy, that's about as droughty as it can be, even for here in the desert. It's tough conditions, and it goes, most of the Western United States right now, you'd say is in, pretty tough drought conditions, all the way into East Texas on the Gulf Coast and places like that. And so, yeah, let's hope we have summer rain, that kind of thing. And so to me, that's an easy thing. Calf crops being weaned prior years to this year's are going to experience what we could say, oh, that's a G/E. There's huge environmental influences on these animals coming through this drought right now. The other thing that happens, out in this part of the world is those very brown spots on this graph are high altitude. So these kind of intercontinental areas that can be so dry, like right in here, can also be very high altitude. Okay, so even here in probably right here where we sit, we're probably almost 4,000 feet of elevation right here. Go up to Albuquerque, you're at 5,000. And so you're kind of in that mile high area all the way from Albuquerque to Denver and up to Fort Collins. There's a lot of altitude influence, and then a lot of cattle raised in these valleys and things in the winter. A lot of them calve out in the spring in valleys or on corn stalks and on the front range of Colorado. And then they go to the mountains for the summer. So they'll go from mile high to 8,000. exposed to a lot of altitude, and we'll talk about those challenges and so forth. And then, I thought we had a really good slide yesterday from Jason Sawyer showing how temperatures increasing in the United States, and there's not a day goes by that we talk about climate change, even though I'm arguing that we should be talking about population growth, and all of the things that people do that drive climate change. Okay. This is not a real easy picture to see it. We know as you go from the south to the north, you're going to have tremendous change in temperature, but it's not just temperature, it's humidity as well. Of course, it's going to be hot here today. I think my phone said 98. You don't stand out there in the sun, it won't be that bad because there's no humidity. But if it was 98 and 50% humidity, it's going to feel a whole lot different. Okay. So we need to think about that. We don't talk about that much in the beef industry. The dairy industry does a lot. They talk about THI, temperature humidity index. Okay. And how important that is to manage dairy cows through heat stress. But we probably need to be talking about that more in the beef industry as well. Yeah. And then took this picture a week or two ago as I went over the Snowy Range to Rouse Ranch. In the West, we usually say snow equal hay. That's where we get our water. And the scary part of that is lack of it. And so I want to talk a little bit about that. Yeah, this is an area you could graze in the summer, be somewhere that you could put cows on, and, as they would come up, usually June, July, August, they got to usually be off of those kind of leases, Forest Service leases by October 1 or some kind of magic date like that. Heavy snow, but as the snow comes off, it'll be beautiful green grass. And yeah, the beef cows will compete with the moose cows and those kind of things for that grazing. But that snow is critical, particularly for the water. And then as we're into these droughts. Yeah, so let's talk about water a little bit and to think about what this means. We have this huge underground aquifer that kind of runs up across the plains. Okay, that's called the Ogallala Aquifer. Okay, and then people like my grandparents that farmed down here on the South Plains of Texas, kind of down in here where that really brown spot is. Yeah, my family's somewhat responsible for that. We pumped a lot of water out of there. Initially, had 8-inch wells pulling water to grow corn and alfalfa. And of course, that was over by the time my life started. And then lately that's gotten to where it's maybe a very efficient center pivot, or it's gone back into CRP. We pumped the underground water aquifer pretty dry and it's not recovering. Okay. And that's a major problem. It's not just a major problem for agriculture, a major problem for cities and metropolitan areas and everybody else that depends on that water. And as you go up that aquifer to the north, okay, that, lowering the level of the aquifer is not as severe, but it's happening. Okay. And that aquifer goes all the way up into Nebraska. And I guess if you've ever been to the town of Ogallala, Nebraska, you probably have a feel for that. Okay. And so Nebraska, and they got that famous phrase up there, the corn huskers, a lot of people depend on that aquifer, but they also have the North Platte River that comes through. And so they got a lot of water sources. And then you get to eastern Nebraska, of course, it rains over there. But let's just talk about this a little bit. These challenges and what this kind of means, kind of that G by E concept. Okay, so this is a slide I spent a lot of time put together. And I apologize, you can't read the first line, but let me tell you how I got to this slide. Western section of our American Society of Animal Science, we do some beef symposium every year. And so last year I put the symposium together and I learned that at Colorado State, our state climatologist was a tremendous speaker. He's employed by the Colorado Ag Experiment Station. And I learned that he was a Jeopardy champion. So I figured, well, heck, if he's a Jeopardy champion, he ought to be pretty good to come talk to people that work with livestock. Okay. And so his name's Russ Schumacher. And so he came and talked to us and he started telling us about, some of the big changes of what we call the Front Range, and that's kind of that east side of the mountains as you go from about Albuquerque up to Cheyenne, Wyoming, and the agriculture challenges of that. And if you think about that area and how many cattle have been fed on that area, big packing plants, big dairy systems, milk plants and things, and how big that is, for U.S. agriculture. Yeah, all of that sets right over the top of this Ogallala Aquifer and depends on also a lot of snow melt and water coming off those mountains and the irrigation systems to support all that Front Range farming and agriculture and so forth. All right, so these were the messages from the climatologist that works for Colorado Ag Experiment Station. And I would like to say that most most state ag experiment stations have a climatologist and big website. And we haven't paid near enough attention to the messages coming off from these areas of our ag experiment stations. But these were the messages from Dr. Schumacher. On the Front Range, we've had the same number of droughts we've had over the past 100 years. Okay. However, over the last 30 years, because of increasing temperature, okay, there's lots of recordings that look like this. Snowpack is 87% of normal. Okay, but because it's hotter and more evaporation, stream flow is 38% of normal. Yeah, that's a devastating number when you start to think about urban sprawl, population growth, and the agriculture needed to support it. This is scary stuff. You know, I'm also a fly fisherman, so that ain't very good news for that either. Okay, so what I have here in this picture is just something to think about. Okay, I got the map there. You can see the Front Range and the Ogallala Aquifer laid over that. Over there on the other side that's a picture of the North Platte River as it goes north, okay, across the Rouse Ranch and our cattle breeding program there. And that water dumps into 3 big lakes in Nebraska or in central Wyoming before it's released to go east across Nebraska to where it will dump into the Missouri River. Okay, and so I drew some arrows on that. So the green arrow represents, you know, there's a whole lot of water supposed to go east and south. And then there's a whole lot of cattle in those yellow arrows that are supposed to go up to the high plains for cattle feeding operations. Okay, so what does all of this mean? I don't know that I have the answer, but I would just say we're in a fragile situation and we better be planning for it. Okay. All right. So let's talk a little bit about G by E. This is a really pretty kind of simple study that we did. Dr. Harvey Blackburn, who works for USDA in Fort Collins, he has a lot to do with genetic preservation. So this is a study from a student that he and I worked with for her master's program, Beth Crable. And it's just kind of thinking about G by E and how you might show that with genotypes. And we thought this is a pretty cool study. The data we used from that was the data that came from the 2000 Bulls Project, which people like Mark Tallman and others from USDA spent a lot of different times talking about that project here. Different breeds contributed, you know, animals to that, and they were 50K genotyped in that. And this was a pretty simple study. There is a much more advanced study to this where Troy Rowan, Jared Decker, and people at Missouri have a whole lot better data set, and they can actually do things across time. And so if you really like to read about G by E, I encourage you to go read that paper. But what's interesting here is if you start to break the United States into, you know, ecological zones, those numbers in there, this was from this was the second study we did first with Hereford, and then we did it with Red Angus. And those numbers that are in there is a number of kind of influential Red Angus sires that were from that area. Okay. And so really kind of the long story is that you'll start to find that, yeah, there's a lot of bulls that get used nationally and internationally, but you'll also always find when you start to analyze these kind of data set, there will be a concentration of a certain kind of genetics that kind of works best in a particular environment. And unfortunately, even though as much advancement as we've made in genetic evaluation and all that, well, we got a lot of work yet to do, right? So that we can kind of fit environmental effects beyond just contemporary group into these models and to account for some of these things. Okay, and so that's what that represents, is just different kinds of Red Angus bulls and so forth. And so I know this is kind of a complicated graph, but I'll work hard to explain it. So this kind of gets into the G by E. So over here, you got different regions, okay? And RA means Red Angus, and then down here, H means Hereford. And then, you know, CA would be cool, arid, cool, humid, just like that for the breeds. And right over here, I got a trait, okay? The trait here is body weight. And then on this axis over here, we've got allele frequency. So really what I would just want you to see, it doesn't have to be that complicated, right? Is that if you pull, you know, in this case, you know, some animals, this square right here, that's supposed to be Red Angus from a cool, humid environment, their allele frequency for this particular SNP or this locus is different from up here. If you go to blue squares, you know, blue squares was Hereford animals from warm, arid climates. It's just showing you that the frequencies of the alleles are different in different environments. That's a really kind of simple way to show it, but I'm just trying to throw it out there that, we have great ability now to actually look at G by E and those kinds of things, and the genotypes help us do that. Okay, so let's start talking about some of the genetic challenges. And I don't know if challenge is the right word or successes, but these are just important G things, genetic things that we need to think about when we think about animals in tough environments. So this is a classic crossbreeding study that was done north of town here on the Chihuahuan Desert, which was crossing Brangus with Hereford. And this data from that study was basically from first, second calf heifers. Right. And so those are animals that are really, really challenged. Those animals are always really challenged in beef production system. It's one of our real difficult traits of the beef industry is how do we get that first calf heifer to rebreed, while she's lactating her first time and she's still growing and all those kind of things. Okay. And so we got a lot of traits over here that are kind of cow calf traits. Okay. Then you got all the different crosses, Brangus on Brangus, Hereford on Hereford, and then the reciprocal crosses, Brangus, Hereford, Herefords. But what I want everybody to look at is this, right? So in other words, the concept of crossbreeding and hybrid vigors, you take animals of fairly similar breeding values, you cross them, and the hybrids are much better than the purebreds, right? And we call that heterosis hybrid vigor. And that really is today, even though with all of our advancements in genomics, that is the foundation of agriculture genetics. Whether you're talking about corn, my long-term resident in Fort Collins, my next door neighbor is in charge of barley growing for Budweiser, not only in North America and globally. And what does the big team of geneticists at Budweiser do in Fort Collins? Their whole effort globally is making inbred lines so they can cross the inbred lines and release the hybrid lines to their growers. That's how they do it. Okay. And so what I want you to see here, though, is that those heterosis values in these first calf heifers, wow, those are big. Okay. This is a tough environment. These animals are weighing in there, just, in the kilogram levels, they're quite little under 400 kilos. So these are first calf heifers. They're 800, 900 pound girls out there trying to rough it on the desert. It's a tough world on them. Right. But that heterosis value in those crosses is tremendous. Okay. And so I think when you talk about desert environments and so forth, that's important. We don't lose sight of that. Okay. This is another study that came out of the Brangus herd that's been on this desert. So that herd has been out on this desert since 1966. And so we spent a lot of time getting back to that body weight issue and thinking about body weight in the desert. Okay. And so the top part of this graph is fall body weight. And that's not just actual body weight. That's asymptotic body weight. So you need about 6 years of data to study each animal's growth curve, know when they actually plateaued at the top of their growth curve. That's what that value really is. And then on the bottom side of this is pregnancy percent. Okay. So when we palpate those cows in the fall, how many's pregnant? Those kinds of values. Okay. And so what I wanted you to see here is that initially, right, cow size on this in desert environment as you went across time from the 70s into the 90s was going up. Okay. And as that went up, pregnancy percent on that environment of those cows in that environment was going down. Okay. And one of the things that I think we did really well with this herd was that we were very, very consistent in our management and our data collection. So very typical thing, spring calvers, 90-day breeding season, May, June, July, pull the bulls out. Okay. But in the early days of that, a cow was allowed to miss twice before she was culled. And then I got here right here in the late 90s, and we were actually in droughts, and you need reasons to cull cows when you go into droughts. And I said, nope, if you've ever missed, anytime you miss, you're out. Don't matter your age or whatever. Okay. And so that just one change, okay, right, made cow size, maybe, or cow size start to go down a little bit and pregnancy rates start to recover a little bit. Okay. Wasn't huge. And you will always be shocked if you go out and tour that herd, because people go out there and they think they're going to see a bunch of little bitty desert cows, and you'll see some like that. But it's always surprising how there's always a few big cows that make it too. Okay. So there's a lot about that we need to learn about. But I just think that's a really interesting data set as we think about cow size. Okay. So I think we're really kind of in a dilemma in the beef industry. Cow size, beef industry size animals tend to get bigger. you know, when I prepare a presentation, I always like lots of pictures. So we built new meat lab facilities at CSU in about 2014. And our original meat lab was built in 1957. That's not the actual rail. Okay. But what I wanted you to see here is that was a rail that was built to hang quarters. Okay. But old meat labs still stand around universities a lot. New Mexico State's replacing theirs right now. They're building a new building right over here. That'll be a wonderful addition to their program. Okay. But what I'm going to see is that old meat lab facilities were small. Okay. And then you build new meat lab facilities, right? And the first set of steers we ran through our new meat lab facility, those steers averaged about 1325. It's still an 11-foot rail. There have been times though where cattle have been so tall that the rail wasn't tall enough. But our new meat lab manager would tell you is no matter how big you made that cooler box, it's not big enough because it's not necessarily the length of the carcass, it's the width of the carcass. So like this meat lab facility was built to hang 24 carcasses in that cooler box. And I tell you what, you put 24 carcasses in there a day and they're in room for anything else. It's big. Okay, the animals are big. So there's some famous graphs that help us understand that. You know, this graph over here is about beef cow inventory, you know, and we've been slowly reducing cattle numbers in the United States since the early 1970s. While over here is about beef supply, even though meat production's going up, this flat line going across like this. So we've been able to maintain our beef supply with less animals. Okay. And a lot of people are arguing that, hey, that's a great thing for this kind of climate neutrality issues, right? The less animals we have, to produce the same amount of product. That's a good thing, right? The dairy industry's arguing the same thing, right? But I just think we're going to come to really some challenging data analysis interpretations over cow size real soon. Okay. So here's where I've started thinking about cow size. This is from a stocking rate study that we were doing on the desert. And I'll use the lowest graph here to talk about this study. Calf crop percent. I think it's the easiest to understand. What this was comparing lightly grazed pastures or light stocking rates to conservative stocking rates. And that's much less than the rest of the United States. Kind of the old rule of range management is you let the cows eat half, but you leave half, right? But here in the desert, you better be more conservative that because you might need that grass a lot longer. Okay. So conservative levels would mean that the animals ate about 40% of the standing forage that was out there. And light means that the animals ate about 25%. You know, and what we learned from that study was that you cannot avoid the bad, big, long droughts. And that's why if you look at this, there's blanks in these graphs because those pastures had to be destocked. However, though, you can survive with a lighter grazing strategy, the short-term graphs. So we were still able to get animal performance measures in some of those light grazed pastures where we had to destock the heavier grazed pastures at 40%. Okay. And so how we came up with these stocking rates was we had a range science team. They would go out there and they'd run all these transects and they would estimate pounds of forage per acre. Right. And in a really good year in this environment, that's about 300. Right. In other years, it might be as low as 30. They got a famous variable in there called ground cover, percent ground cover with nothing on it. Right. If you go over where my Rice family ranches on the Gulf Coast, you know, like that's a crazy variable. How do you have ground with no grass on it? Right. And we talk about growing 3,000 pounds of forage per acre over there, but that's different over here. But what comes out of that though, is you estimate how many pounds of forage you have in that pasture. Right. And then you you got average weights on the cows and you figure they're going to eat 2.5% of body weight. And you could calculate how many cows go in there. Okay. Yeah. So we got bigger cows. That means we're going to have less cows in each pasture, but they're going to consume that level. So my question in that though is, okay, you put these cows out there and they weigh 1,100 or maybe today they weigh 1,300. And so now I've got a quarter or a third less cows than I used to, to consume that same amount of forage. But when do I reach a point where the cow has gotten so big that they actually can't motor around that pasture enough to sustain themselves? I don't know the answer to that. I think that's something we're going to have to think about in the real future. Our animals are getting bigger and bigger all the time. And that's been, I think, a good thing. Or how do we make cows maintain themselves on that without losing all that size? I just think there's a lot of questions that we're going to be addressing here at BIF for for many years to come. And then over the top of all that, how in the heck are we going to make us food supply with these environmental challenges and this population growth and not be at deficit? Okay, so let's talk about another environmental challenge. We'll talk about altitude. We talked about cows that, you know, we talk a lot in here at BIF about PAP and and tolerance to altitude and things like that. But there's also just another part of it. How do the animals work the landscape? I took this picture in the Pyrenees between Spain and France. Yeah. Cows, there are some cows, it's amazing how they will walk on hillsides and graze. Just like I'm sure there's people from Louisiana could show pictures of cattle walking around in the mucky water and finding things to eat. Okay. And we spend a lot of time talking about cows over here on this graph that we call bottom dwellers versus hilltoppers. Those that like to go and climb hills and those that don't. And, you know, one of the really challenging parts of that is we've always asked, why is that? You know, some of our initial genome-wide association type studies, and I'll explain this graph in just a minute, tell us that, you know, there's a few markers, you know, it's kind of that rise up out of that. And those things usually have to do with appetite. Kind of makes sense, right? So a cow walks further because she's hungry. Or does she walk further because she's satiated and she's bored and like to go for a walk? I don't know the answer to that. Right. But this is how we get to some of those answers. This is what we call a Manhattan plot. So over here on this axis, we got some kind of statistic. And then across the bottom here, each color is a different chromosome. Right. There's 29 autosomes in cattle and then the XY. So for 30 total. And then everywhere a dot comes up off the graph, you know, we're saying, well, there's something on the chromosome right there that's important, that's driving that dot up off the graph. And we call this a Manhattan plot, you know, because if you looked across the top of it, it kind of looked like the skyline of Manhattan with all the buildings coming up off the streets. Obviously, that's not the skyline of Manhattan, Kansas, right? Okay, so then another thing as we think about some of these challenges that are ahead of us, we heard a lot yesterday about carbon, methane, CO2, you know, and a lot of efforts initially want to look at methane production, a lot of methane measuring systems right now going into grow safe systems where we're measuring feed intake. Quite a bit of dairy data out there showing that, you know, animals that are more feed efficient actually, you know, have less methane. That genetic correlation is kind of moderate. So I think in the next few years, we're going to have a lot of folks in the beef industry bring that kind of data forward. But I just want to show this, you know, as we think about the genetic challenge, I don't think it's just as simple as measuring methane. I think we should be doing that without a doubt. We got to go down that road. We need that data. We needed that data yesterday. Okay. But I think when you think about this whole carbon cycle, and I think that's how we got to think about it. Yeah, it's about carbon in forms of CO2 in the atmosphere and what gets sequestered into the soils, how much of this grass we're pulling off the top, you know, that percent use value as we would think about on rangeland, how much it goes into the animal, how much methane comes out of the animal. It's a whole system. It's a whole system. And I think when you start thinking about the genetics of that and the animal that fits that the best, again, how does that relate just to cow weight? I don't know. I'm asking a lot of questions here about where we're going and with G by E. Okay, so let's get a little word from those of wisdom. So Bob Prosser wasn't able to make it here today. Bob's from Arizona, the Bartee Bar Ranches. He raises Gelbvieh, Balancer, Angus, and some heat tolerant crosses. Okay, and that's Bob there. Must have been a windy day in Arizona because he's ducking his head, trying to keep the wind from blowing his hat off. Okay, so these are some of the messages from Bob, and I really encourage the people that put the BIF together, just because Bob couldn't be here today. If there's another opportunity in the near future to get him there, I really encourage you to do that. He had a lot of words of wisdom. Let me just do my best to summarize some of the things that Bob would have said to this group. He ranches in central Arizona, what they call high desert, ponderosa pine country. He couldn't be here today because of labor. We've already heard that once, and they're having a hard time keeping labor, and then they're fighting this drought, and he just didn't feel like he could leave. Okay, but these are some of his messages. You know, he said heterosis is the most important range management tool, and when it comes to making crosses of animals, often you need multiple breeds in a commercial composite cow. Okay. Bob is really into I would say probably most of his bull buyers and things are probably cow-calf producers, and he really thinks about stability and longevity, but he says those are not the same traits. Stability is not longevity. Okay. And then Bob came up with a strategy, particularly for his commercial herd, and that he was keeping very good records, and he knew who was 10 years old and older in his herd, and he put those in a group. And then he was saving a lot of heifers out of that herd for his replacements. And yeah, the heifer breed up was pretty good, but he said it was amazing how in the first calf heifers, how much better they were than the rest of his herd. The problem with that is if you just think about the time frame to pull that off, right? Wait 10 years for a cow to prove whether she can be a 10-year-old cow or not. And, and so, yeah. And so he's been spending a lot of time looking at genotyping tools to get these answers earlier. So now he collects DNA on his calf crop at what we call spring branding in the West. And he's genotyping right now with the Inherit product through Zoetis and the Leachman group and that kind of thing, because he's trying to get more as early life information as he can, because this drought forced him to sell that group of 10-year-old cows. He says the most painful thing he ever witnessed, but drought is drought. He didn't have choice. Okay, so I'd like to talk a little bit about things that I learned from working in the Western Region Beef Cattle Breeders Group. That group is called W1. We're kind of proud of that because we're the oldest kind of these ag experimentation regional projects together. I don't really necessarily know. I think that group probably started somewhere in the 60s. Our last time that we wrote a crossbreeding bulletin was published 1999. And that was a really interesting time because that was at the time when ag experiment stations, a lot of them had crossbreeding projects and a lot of cattle. And at that time, when I joined the group, we were at the point where people were talking a lot about maternal heterosis and the cow side of it. And this was a graph that we made from that. Actually, I think Mike Tess made this graph. Okay, him and Mike McNeil, two guys from Montana that worked and made this graph. So it's kind of a three-way thing. On this axis right here, we got body weight of the cow. We're kind of ranking them from small up to large cows. Over here, we got milk production level. And in the middle, we got rainfall level. Okay. So here on the Chihuahuan Desert, we're a less than 12-inch rainfall area. So according to this, we need kind of medium to low milking cows that are medium to small. But then, you could get up in northeast New Mexico, eastern Colorado, up to the Rouse Ranch in Wyoming. Then you can get in this area and you could have, this suggests you could have large cows, fairly high milking, just depends on those resources. So I wanted to talk about this just a little bit. And so, this Chihuahuan Desert area, that's a picture of it up there in the top, and some Brahman cows out there on that Chihuahuan Desert. Okay. Yeah. And so you would expect us to have kind of smaller kind of cows. And this is a bull that we were able to acquire because we had a real problem when I got here, and that the people that were breeding that herd before me had done a really good job, but inbreeding was starting to be a problem. Okay. We did a lot of AI, but it was very, very difficult to identify sires that came from more rainfall, eastern environments to bring into this desert environment. So we got the idea that even though we were going to continue to do that, a lot of AI, we needed to breed a Brangus from scratch, so we could influx, some new genetics or reconstitute that composite. So we built a little Brahman herd to do that. And we found a bull that originally, his genetics came from the Boot Hill of New Mexico, very southeast Arizona. And the bull was owned by Lauren Pratt. And he was a bull called Mr. 6X Sunland 874. And right there, he probably out in his working clothes on the desert. That's what he looked at maturity. And he probably weighed 1750. That's as big as he was. Okay. At that same time, out of those Brahman cows, then we would AI, and people like the Hudgens group and stuff were very kind to us and gave us semen and whatnot. And so we made a bull called NMSU 7057. And if you went out to the Ranch Heritage Center last night and you saw the Brahman bull out there, that'd be a son of him. Okay. And this bull, I mated that cow 3 times to a bull called 500, Mr. Sir Garrett Manzo 500, and got 2 heifers and a bull, and this was the bull. And, it's just variation. He was everything on the right side of growth that there ever was. We never saw a Brahman bull grow in a bull test like this one did. He was massive. And so it was obvious by the time we got to the end of our yearling bull test that, man, that's an impressive bull, but he don't belong here. Right. So we offered the bull for sale. Mike Parton in Florida from Heart Bar Ranches bought him. Okay. And Mike liked to show cattle, and so he showed him. So from whenever the bull was born, 2007-ish, he would be the 57th calf born in 2007 to when he stopped his showing in whatever that was, 2010. He won more Brahman show points than any bull in a decade. Okay. And I'm not saying that because I want to show cattle. I'm just trying to tell you something. And so I went to Houston to get my picture made with him because that's kind of a cool thing, you know, something I'll remember the rest of my life, you know. So there he is at Houston. And that day right there, he weighed 2750. And he was the smallest bull in his class that day of 3-year-old bulls. Smallest. Okay. And it's just very interesting because here we got two bulls out of the same breeding program, and there's 1,000 pounds difference between those two pictures. Roughly 800 to 1,000 pound difference. If you look at their EPDs, they, you know, I have to go look at Brahman more. I didn't see that they had a mature weight EPD. You know, carcass weight, and these are very low accuracy numbers. That's why I didn't put the accuracies on there. They're not that different. Yearling weight, they're not that different. Ribeye area between, I got these backwards. This is my old slides. Okay. This should be 7057 up here and 874 down here. The 7057 bull had a massive ribeye and almost no marbling. The old bull out on the desert has one of the highest marbling values I've ever seen for a Brahman animal. And do I think there was something magical or some gene that he carried? No, I think what was very different about him is he had a very Bos Taurus-like growth curve. Okay. Marbling, those kind of things, very polygenic traits. Yeah. And we were very happy with that. He did. He scanned, you know, his progeny would scan, you know, like a 4% kind of thing, like some of our Angus animals. Okay. What's going on here? Okay. So we made a son out of him, a 3/4 blood bull. This was his son that we made out of him. Okay. Out of those kind of breedings, that kind of thing. And we bred him to Angus, and down there, some of the Brangus babies we made out of him. We made a bull out of that. And that was the happiest day of my life because when we got ready to put bulls out there, we didn't have to go in and get the pedigree book out and sort cows because of our inbreeding problem into different groups, because this group would be less inbred than that group. When I had a son of 7057, he wasn't related to nobody, and we could put him in any pasture we wanted. Okay. And when you got to stock a lot of grazing studies and things like that, whew, that was a big relief. Okay. But that deal really worked. I just wanted you all to see that. That's just a much different kind of animal. I think he is a smaller, less performing, even though he had great marbling. He's just very different from the typical kind of, I would call tropical level Brahman today. He's very different. Yeah. So it gets back to this. That was the question. Can we manage G by E across environments to produce competitive, acceptable product? Absolutely. I think we can do that. I think all the tools we have today, as we build better and better EPDs, even though we'd say we'd like to do them better, our EPDs and things help us do that. It helped me tremendously, you know, to be able to think about these matings, make these matings, and so forth.